I'm Clay Johnson. As Deputy Director for Management at the Office of Management and Budget, it is my job to ensure our federal government is results-oriented. Under the auspices of the President's management agenda, OMB is working with agencies to facilitate the adoption of results-based disciplines and habits that are effective and enduring. One of the disciplines we have focused on is competitive sourcing, which calls on agencies to examine the commercial activities their employees perform to determine whether it is more efficient to have these activities performed in-house or by an outside contractor. Our rationale for asking agencies to become savvy in the use of competition is rather simple. Application of competition to in-house operations has long been shown to help agencies reduce costs and improve performance. Critics of competitive sourcing have raised a number of concerns to discourage agencies from planning and pursuing competition. Some argue that the cost of competition will exceed savings. Others warn that the competition will dismantle the workforce. Still others claim that managers will lose control if work is contracted out. The facts paint a much different picture. Competitions completed in fiscal year 2003 alone are expected to generate more than $1 billion in savings or cost avoidance over the next 3 to 5 years. That's $12,000 for each full-time equivalent employee studied, irrespective of whether the work is performed by the government or the private sector. Through these competitions, the government concluded that best value is provided by the in-house organization in nearly 89% of the FTEs competed, hardly a dismantling of our workforce. Nor is there any reason for managers to fear loss of control. By creating a performance work statement that defines measurable results, managers gain increased control and accountability for work. Many, but not all, agencies have achieved success. The video you're about to see is designed to share best practices and review the basic building blocks of public-private competition so that all agencies can build and maintain an effective competitive sourcing program. You will hear from a number of agencies that have been rated green on the Management Agenda scorecard for using competition the right way, meaning in a reasoned and responsible manner. As you listen to their experiences, remember that results can only get better with experience, and $1 billion in savings is a pretty good start for our taxpayers.
So what can you expect from this tool? Because it's web-based, you have the option to watch it in its entirety, or you can watch it by module. Say you are just starting the FAIR Act inventory process, and that is all you wish to focus on for the time being. Just click on the link to that module, and you are on your way. Even though the Office of Management and Budget Circular A-76 establishes policies and procedures for the effective use of competitive sourcing, it is important that an agency tailor the use of competition to its mission and workforce mix. Creative solutions and long-term outlook combine to build an effective foundation for competitive sourcing decisions and processes. OMB encourages creative and innovative thinking and is committed to providing prompt, constructive feedback on agency proposals. The key point to remember as you work to improve your program is that competitive sourcing is a tool to help you operate in the most efficient manner consistent with the interests of both taxpayers and employees. Innovative approaches developed by your fellow agencies include using an internal scorecard, ensuring impasses are addressed in a timely manner, looking horizontally across the agency for opportunities to compete common enterprise-wide commercial support services, and coordinating closely with the Human Capital Initiative. It is essential for an agency to not only establish the necessary infrastructure to support a competitive sourcing program, but to also employ responsible leaders who conduct a fair and transparent competition between the public and private sector.
At the IRS, we're taking a corporate or strategic approach to competitive sourcing. We want to use competitive sourcing to bring about transformational change in the organization. It's not about competing today's organization. We want to run a competition so that we're looking at where we want to be strategically 3 to 5 years out.
So at IRS here, we conduct a really thorough industry-proven business case analysis to ensure that before we go off and do this competitive sourcing study, we know that there's going to be some significant cost efficiencies and performance improvements. At IRS, the approach that we take is transformational change, not just incremental, small steps. And to make major change, it takes a lot of hard work by a lot of people at all levels. And if all levels aren't engaged, then you can't be successful. And that means up to the commissioner level.
OMB Circular A-76 requires an agency to establish centralized oversight responsibility, beginning with a competitive sourcing official, or CSO. The CSO implements the circular and works closely with the agency's Office of Competitive Sourcing to oversee, collect, and verify Fair Act inventory, as well as provide overall guidance. The CSO writes or collects justifications for inherently governmental personnel and cancellations for competitions, grants time limit waivers, and appoints competition officials. Such officials include the functional team official, who implements the competition, the performance work statement team leader and team that develop the performance work statement, quality assurance surveillance plan, and assists the CO with developing the solicitation. The contracting officer issues the solicitation, awards the contract, and works with the performance work statement team. The source selection authority, who certifies the decision to award either the private or public sector. The source selection evaluation board evaluates proposals and negotiates the acquisition. The agency tender official, or ATO, develops and submits the in-house proposal, also known as the agency tender. The most efficient organization team supports the ATO in developing the staffing plan and agency tender. The human resource advisor assists the ATO on personnel-related matters when developing the agency tender. Later, we'll discuss the specific roles of some of these officials during the pre-planning phase of competitive sourcing. The revised circular has built-in firewalls between these participants to avoid any conflicts of interest and building confidence in the process. Ultimately, these officials support a much broader agency goal of meeting the mission, human capital, and strategic needs of an agency. Again, competitive sourcing should be used as a management tool to achieve performance improvements, savings, and innovations. Involving the right players early on will ensure a smoother execution.
Having the champions within the business units to support this leadership that we've provided for the teams has been a major impact that we've been able to have for success.
I think it also helps that we identify not necessarily individuals who have been working in that function or that business unit under study, but individuals who have a vision, who look for opportunities to re-engineer the workforce, to look at market research, to bring about best practices and the work that we're doing today.
Positive results in competitive sourcing are achieved with leadership and management support, and it's best to involve employees in the competitive sourcing process. Supporting the organization with expert consultants who understand how to conduct competitions is very important.
The most basic policies supporting competitive sourcing say that an agency should identify all activities performed by government personnel as either inherently governmental or commercial. We'll talk about this in more detail with the Fair Act module. The circular states that an inherently governmental, or IG function, is one that requires substantial discretion in making decisions for the government. Agencies are required to provide justifications for this classification. Designate a competitive sourcing official, or CSO. Centralize oversight responsibility to instill fairness, trust, and consistency in the process. Use a streamlined or standard competition to determine if government personnel should perform a commercial activity. Develop cost estimates using compare costing software. Apply the Federal Acquisition Regulation in addition to the circular for either streamlined or standard competitions. Establish performance standards in annual performance evaluations to hold agency officials accountable. Track the execution of streamlined and standard competitions. Assist affected employees by providing various career transition and general career counseling support if employees are deployed to other organizations within the agency. Not perform work as a contractor or subcontractor to the private sector. The competitive sourcing process begins with the preparation of an inventory of your agency's activities. The Federal Activities Inventory Reform Act, also known as the FAIR Act, requires agencies to annually identify their commercial activities. OMB Circular A-76 further requires agencies to identify which of its commercial activities are available for competition. It also requires agencies to identify their inherently governmental activities. Just because a job is classified as commercial doesn't mean that it must be contracted out or even that it must be studied. We will address this in a minute.
The National Park Service has a systematic approach to our competitive sourcing program. First, we develop an accurate FAIR Act inventory, which is the basis for our competitive sourcing plan. Our inventory is prepared through our personnel system and is the baseline, as I mentioned, for the functions available for competition. First, we take our automated payroll system, separate it into inherently governmental and commercial FTE, then by function code. 3 years ago, we formed a steering committee to review the inventories and to make decisions like how to count part-time FTE and which functions are inherently governmental versus commercial, to determine reason code A functions, and so forth. In 2004, for example, we've expanded the use of reason code A FTE, which are considered core to the mission. This past year, NPS received 1,500 reason code A justifications from the field. We've also developed blanket reason code A justifications for some FTE, such as treatment plant operators, some scientists, and park guides. In summary, there are 3 guiding principles when it comes to the FAIR Act: consistency across the Bureau, employee morale, maintaining trust and accountability, and understanding by the public, OMB and Congress.
Annual inventories must be submitted to OMB electronically for review each year by the end of June. So it's a good idea to plan ahead and start the process early, at least 2 months before the due date. For annual inventories, an agency shall use the format and data requirements found at the OMB website. Your competitive sourcing office should provide guidance on what you should use as the baseline for your inventory. For example, 3rd quarter pay period data. Now, categorize your positions as inherently governmental or commercial. An inherently governmental function is a function that is so intimately related to the public interest as to mandate performance by a government employee. Determining whether a particular function is an inherently governmental function depends upon the analysis of the totality of the circumstances. Each agency should develop inventory guidance for its bureaus and offices so that each codes its functions consistently. For the purposes of this tool, let's look at some key questions to help determine if a function is inherently governmental. If a function is not deemed inherently governmental, then it must be coded commercial. There are 6 reason codes for coding a commercial function. You must assign a reason code each time commercial status, or C, is applied. A commercial function may be coded with reason A when the CSO determines that it is not suitable for performance by the private sector. A good example of this is Census Bureau data collection. Although collecting data is a commercial activity, meaning the marketplace offers many data collection companies from the private sector, a majority of the data must be collected in a manner that is viewed as objective, impartial, and free from any public perception of political bias or agenda. Other reasons why activities may be unsuitable for competition include the lack of private sector expertise, that is, lack of sources in the private sector to compete for the work, and the need to preserve core competencies. A commercial function reason B is used when it is suitable for streamlined or standard competition. A commercial function reason C is used when the position is currently the subject of a study. D, if it is part of an activity that has already been competed and won by the in-house team within the past 5 years. E, if it is part of a restructuring effort, or F, if a statutory requirement prevents competition. Keep in mind that the FAIR Act inventory is the first step in the competitive sourcing process. So, as you identify function codes for commercial activities, think horizontally so that activities can be grouped strategically when it comes time to think more carefully about competition. In other words, think first of the most general category a position would fall under and get more specific from there.
We approach competitive sourcing at the Administration for Children and Families much like any other government agency. The first thing we do is we develop our FAIR Act inventory, which clearly states which activities are commercial in nature and those that are inherently governmental. For those commercial activities that can be competed, we conduct studies with the ultimate goal of doing business better, faster, and smarter for the federal government.
At IRS, we have a very unique process in that we have constructed or put together a FAIR Act inventory coordination group that is comprised of all of the business divisions in IRS, and the membership there are very highly qualified individuals who really take on some very serious issues of coding those functions in IRS as inherently governmental or commercial in nature. It's real important that the process that we go through in the end reflects the work done here at IRS, so that when that inventory is published and it's out there on the Treasury website, as you know, after it's been approved by OMB, we know that we can defend our inventory if there's any challenge because of the thorough process that we've gone through to ensure that every business division is weighed in at the highest level, and that if we need to, we'll go to our Strategic Resources Committee, which is at the highest level, Deputy Commissioner level, to ensure that whatever is there, we agree to and is supportable and defensible.
Let's take a moment to review the mechanics of filling out an inventory spreadsheet. For the National Park Service, you would enter 010-24 found on the AGBU_FTE tab. Next, you'd enter the abbreviation NPS. Enter the function location you are coding, for example, Atlanta, Georgia. Enter the activity function you are coding from the drop-down box and the number of employees in that function for that specific location. A list of all function codes can be found at the following web address by clicking on the Handouts tab. The site lists all main functions from A to Z. As you can see, each function is a general category. Several sub-functions or activities are displayed within each category. To continue with our example of the National Park Service, let's use function category S, Installation Services and Activity Code S715, Office Equipment Maintenance and Repair. For this exercise, we will enter 5 full-time employees. Now, let's use an IG example. Look at the Transportation and Safety Administration. For this exercise, let's say they have 10 employees in Washington, D.C. who conduct testing on automobiles. This is for activity R400, testing. Because the mission of the agency is to generally investigate accidents and issue safety recommendations aimed at preventing future accidents, the activity should be coded IG because these employees are making value judgments and decisions affecting public safety on behalf of the federal government. Other things to keep in mind: it's also essential to involve your human resource organization. Although human resources may not be directly involved in the inventory process, their involvement early on for administrative purposes will ensure that the inventory process will run smoothly. As early as February, you and your agency's competitive sourcing office should involve human resources to ensure that published best practices are in place. Human resources will also be key to the success of any studies you conduct, so involve them early and often. After submission, OMB reviews each agency inventory, consults with the agency regarding inventory content, and then publishes a notice in the Federal Register that annual agency inventories are available. The agency then makes the inventories available to Congress and the public. The inventory is now open to challenges from employees and the private sector. OMB Circular A-76 allows challenges to either classification or reclassification of an activity as C or IG, as well as challenges to the agency's choice of reason codes. After the inventory process is complete, it's time to look at which commercial activities, those coded commercial with reason code B, could be studied. Your decision on whether to start a competitive sourcing study should involve an identification of the risks and an assessment of their costs. This begins the preliminary planning phase. At a minimum, you should consider the following questions. Would it be easy to transition the activities under consideration? What would be the impact on the department's modernization, budget, and workforce planning initiatives? Are there risks to mission accomplishment? Is the same service widely available in the private sector? Is there a potential for achieving efficiencies and cost savings? Are there industry performance standards? Feasibility studies generally include the following steps led by a functional team official. Scope, the activities and full-time equivalent positions to be competed. Grouping, in a recent assessment of competitions completed in FY04, OMB found that agencies which place the greatest emphasis on strategically grouping their commercial activities end up yielding the best return from competition. This often includes looking horizontally across the agency for common commercial services, such as finance and accounting, education and training, and communications and information services. The General Accounting Office has also encouraged agencies to take an enterprise-wide approach to competition whenever feasible. Workload data and systems. What kind of data is available? Are processes documented? Are position descriptions up to date? Are there outputs and reports available? Can you see how the work is broken down? Baseline cost. What does the activity cost now? Schedule. Develop preliminary competition and completion schedules. Business case analysis. Provide a cost-benefit analysis, marketability analysis, and recommendation for competition. Type of competition. Determine if you'll use a streamlined or standard competition format. You can use a streamlined or standard competition study if the commercial activity is performed by the agency with 65 or fewer full-time employees. You would always use a standard competition if the commercial activity were performed by more than 65 full-time employees. Competitions have set time frames. Agencies have 90 days from the day of announcement to the day of completion to conduct a streamlined competition unless an extension is needed. For a standard competition, the time frame is 1 year, though an extension of up to 6 months can be granted if the study becomes complex. Because the clock starts ticking as soon as the required public announcement is made, you should invest sufficient time in the planning process to ensure that the agency has taken the steps necessary to use the competition effectively.
Difficult challenges include just taking that first step and initiating a competition, establishing an infrastructure to make competitive sourcing efforts understandable and fair is also very important. Often employees and managers are reluctant to engage in competitions, but overcome that with experience and usually realize that competitive sourcing is not that difficult, and in most cases the federal government wins.
The National Park Service has a systematic approach to our competitive sourcing program. First, we develop an accurate Fair Act inventory, which is the basis for our competitive sourcing plan. Next, we review our workforce structure and our human capital plan. We determine what areas may be difficult to recruit, or where significant retirement is likely in the near future, or where our mission may have changed or technology advanced and changed the way we do our work. Then we ask ourselves the question, is the National Park Service providing these services in the most efficient, effective manner possible? If we don't have a solid affirmative answer, we may decide to conduct a competitive sourcing study through the competitive sourcing program.
You must do your research. Learn as much as you can about the A-76 process, the functions to be studied, and the market conditions.
The functional team official prepares for the competition by identifying the roles and responsibilities for key competition team members and ad hoc members. These roles, all filled by inherently governmental employees, are laid out in the circular, but the main appointments are for Agency Tender Official, ATO. The ATO is the official with the decision-making authority who is responsible for the agency tender and represents the agency tender during source selection. The position operates independently from the contracting officer and the source selection authority to ensure each bid is developed without knowledge of the other's cost. Contracting officer. The contracting officer is responsible for participating on the performance work statement team and issuing the solicitation to the private sector and other agencies, and developing the criteria that will be used to evaluate incoming bids. This position awards the contract and issues the most efficient organization letter of obligation or agreement to the winning bidder. The contracting officer and source selection authority may be the same individual. Performance Work Statement Team Leader, PWS. The PWS team leader is independent of the agency tender official, human resource advisor, and most efficient organization team. He or she develops the materials and plans that are used to assist the contracting officer in developing a solicitation and ultimately assist in implementing the performance decision. Human Resource Advisor, HRA. The HRA is a human resource expert responsible for advising management on HR issues and assisting the ATO in developing the agency tender. Source Selection Authority, SSA. The SSA is responsible for source selection as required by the FAR and OMB Circular A-76. The SSA and CEO may be the same individual. The functional team leader will also spearhead the development of communications, training, and data collection plans. And one final point, the pre-planning phase should be conducted with the greatest amount of sensitivity paid to the studied organizations and their personnel. That is why it is important to involve HR from the beginning. HR can help you with your communications planning and can help answer employee questions during this phase. The information collected, analyzed, and presented is considered to be pre-decisional management information and will not be released without the approval of your competitive sourcing office and, if applicable, the executive steering group that oversees the program. Once the pre-planning phase is complete, the agency will inform the incumbent service providers of the date the public announcement will be made. The agency will then announce the start date of a standard or streamlined competition. Now, let's talk about the streamlined competition process. To break it down, there are 4 main steps. Make the public announcement, which will then serve as the date the competition starts. You and your team will have 90 calendar days from that point to complete the study, unless you are going to develop a most efficient organization document. The MEO document demonstrates how your organization will provide the best value for taxpayers. If so, your competitive sourcing office can grant an extension of up to 45 days. Your agency will make a formal public announcement at your local site and on the Fed BizOps website at a minimum. After the announcement, you will develop a cost estimate. Your agency will calculate, compare, and certify costs by completing the streamlined competition form. Let's talk briefly about the form. Using the form, you will show the cost for the current state, how it's performed today, but it is strongly recommended that your agency develops a most efficient organization. Remember, the private sector and other agencies will be competing for this activity, so showing how the government can best perform is the ideal way to make a decision on where the activity should reside. Your agency will also need to determine an estimated contract price for performing the activity with a private sector source, using documented market research or soliciting cost proposals in accordance with federal acquisition regulations. The agency will also calculate the adjusted cost estimate. Review the Circular A-76 for detailed information on how to perform this task. It's also important that cost estimate firewalls be established. This means that the person or team preparing the agency cost estimate is different than the person or team preparing the private sector estimate, and that information is not shared between the two. Once the cost estimate is complete, it's time to make the performance decision. 3 people will certify the agency and private sector or other agency estimates and award the lowest bidder. Prior to the announcement, and consistent with procurement integrity standards of conduct, the agency will allow the employees who currently provide the service to review the streamlined competition form. Once complete, the agency will make a formal announcement at the local level and through www.fedbizops.gov. After the announcement, the contracting officer will execute a letter of obligation with an official responsible for performing the commercial activity. The agency may retain the work or the work may be transitioned to the private sector or another agency known as a public reimbursable source. Look to the circular for specific details on how to implement the performance decision. And remember, the vast majority of the competitions completed in FY03 were won by government employees. Just because a competition has been scheduled, it does not mean the activity or function will automatically be outsourced. In fact, even if a function is outsourced, it does not always mean employees will be without a job. Employees often say they have received better opportunities as a result of competition because they receive career counseling and are placed in operating units where the work best matches individual skills and the potential for growth is often greater.
Some success stories in our competitive sourcing program include the Southeast Archaeology Center in Tallahassee, Florida. This was a streamlined competition where we hired consultants to conduct market analysis and to prepare the MEO most efficient organization. We're proud to say that the archaeologists won hands down because they showed they could save $850,000 a year by re-engineering their processes.
At the Department of Labor, where I currently serve, I've conducted more generic competitions that have included streamlined non-MEO market comparisons, which were all retained. Streamlined non-MEO competition, where we actually issued a formal solicitation to generate competition, and it was not retained because we had competition. But it did generate over $1.5 million in projected savings, and that's a win. We also did 3 recent streamlined non-MEO studies that included IT operations, invoicing, and administrative support. All 3 studies were retained in-house as being most cost-effective for the taxpayer based on market comparisons. OMB rules for streamlined studies make it very easy. It's almost a no-brainer to execute these types of competitions through a market analysis against government fully burdened labor comparables, providing a true apples-to-apples comparison.
Assuming you viewed the pre-planning phase module, now let's talk about the standard competition process. To break it down, there are 7 main steps. Make the public announcement, which will then serve as the competition start date. You and your team will have 12 months from that point to complete the study unless the process becomes complex, in which case an extension of up to 6 months can be granted. Develop and issue the solicitation. To do this, the agency will need to make team designations. Performance work statement team. The PWS team leader will establish this team to develop the performance work statement, the solicitation that identifies technical, functional, and performance characteristics of the agency's requirements. The PWS is performance-based and describes the agency's needs, the what, but not specific methods for meeting those needs, the how. The PWS identifies essential outcomes to be achieved, specifies the agency's required performance standards, and specifies the location, units, quality, and timeliness of the work. Most efficient organization team. The MEO team leader will establish this team to develop the most efficient organization. The staffing plan of the agency tender developed to represent the agency's most efficient and cost-effective organization. An MEO is required for a standard competition and may include a mix of government personnel and MEO subcontracts. MEO team members cannot be a part of the PWS team. Lastly, the source selection functional team official will appoint the source selection evaluation board, who assists in the source selection as required by the FAR and OMB Circular A-76. Employees that work in the activity or function being studied, and anybody with knowledge of the agency tender shall not participate in any manner on the source selection evaluation board. All teams will follow the methodology and requirements laid out in the OMB Circular A-76, so make sure to use it as your guide as you execute the process. Once the team members have developed the required materials, it is time to solicit offers from the private sector, other agencies, and the agency in-house team. During a standard competition, the contracting officer will consider issuing a draft of the PWS or solicitation for public review and comment, including directly affected employees and their representatives. follow Federal Acquisition Regulation provisions, A-76, source selection provisions, unique provisions to the agency tender, provide a solicitation closing date that all offers must follow, identify proposal reference information in the PWS, establish performance periods, announce whether government-furnished property is available to prospective providers, identify common cost, alert potential providers whether performance bonds are required, determine incentive and award fee procedures if applicable, require inclusion of a phase-in and quality control plans as part of the proposals. To conclude step 3, the PWS team will develop a quality assurance surveillance plan. The plan identifies the methods the agency will use to measure the performance of the provider, public or private, against the PWS. Finally, the contracting officer will create a competition file to include all documents created for the standard competitions. More detail and samples are included in the A-76 circular. Upon issuance of the solicitation, prospective offers develop their proposals. In the case of the in-house team, that means developing the agency tender. The agency tender is the department management plan submitted in response to a solicitation. Essentially, it is the agency's bid for retaining the activity. The agency tender includes an MEO, agency cost estimate, MEO quality control plan, MEO phase-in plan, and copies of any MEO subcontracts. The agency tender is prepared by the agency tender official, or ATO, as required by the circular. Once complete, the ATO delivers the agency tender to the contracting officer in a sealed package by the solicitation closing date. This will then be compared with bids or offers received from the private sector and other agencies. Agencies should make all reasonable efforts to encourage private sector participation. There is a possibility that the agency will receive no acceptable bids from the private sector or other agencies. If this occurs, there is a process that is then launched to determine next steps. Assuming that acceptable bids were received, the next step is to perform the source selection. Selecting who will be the service provider can be handled in one of two ways: a sealed bid acquisition or a negotiated acquisition. If it's a sealed bid acquisition, the contracting officer will open the agency tender and the offers from the private sector and other agencies or public reimbursable sources on the closing date. The contracting officer will then enter the apparent lowest bidder into the standard competition form and validate whether that bidder has responded appropriately to the requirements in the solicitation. In a negotiated acquisition process, the contracting officer will review all offers and evaluate technical acceptability and cost. Once a selection has been made, the CO shall enter the private sector or public reimbursable cost on the standard competition form. In the revised circular A-76, there is a process where agencies can trade cost factors with non-cost factors within certain constraints, so be sure to review the guidance as you go. Once the contracting officer has entered the data in the standard competition form, the sixth step, making the performance decision, is almost complete. The contracting officer and the source selection authority will certify the standard competition form, signifying the end date of the competition. To close this step, a public announcement will be made at the local level and in www.fedbizops.gov. The contracting officer will debrief the agency and all private sector and agency bidders, and then release the certified standard competition form and agency tender to the public. This leaves us at the final step, awarding the contract or issuing an agreement and implementing the decision. For a performance decision favoring the agency or the incumbent, the contracting officer will establish an MEO letter of obligation with an official responsible for performance of the MEO. If it's a private sector provider, the contracting officer will award a contract in accordance with the FAR. If the performance goes to a public reimbursable source, the contracting officer will develop a fee-for-service agreement with the agency. If your agency does not retain the activity or function, employees will be affected. It's necessary to reiterate HR's importance to the process. Involve them early and often to ensure that employees' needs are taken care of at every phase of the competitive sourcing process.
Competitions I recently participated in include, in 2003, a standard competition for the Office of Personnel Management that garnered about $10 million in savings. And in 2004, streamlined and standard competitions for the Department of Labor that garnered around $9 million in avoided costs and $2 million in savings.
DoD's competitive sourcing consists of completing 12,000 public-private competitions under the old circular. Of those 12,000 competitions, 500 were cost comparisons, 50 were streamlined cost comparisons, and 650 were direct conversions. These competitions impacted over 88,000 positions, both military and civilian. The first standard competition we announced in '04 was on the 2nd of June, was the Corps of Engineers multi-location, multifunction competition for information technology. This is a large competition impacting 1,500 DoD civilians and over 500 contracts.
We completed a standard competition recently for the printing and reprographics function at the national headquarters. The standard time frame is normally 12 months. That was completed in just 7 months, 5 months early, saving over $2 million over 5 years, the period of performance.
The Department of Energy hadn't done competitive sourcing studies for nearly 2 decades. When the President's management agenda was inaugurated, we decided that we would launch about 7 of these studies. This was in fiscal year '02 and fiscal year '03. Those 7 studies involved 1,200 federal FTEs and 1,000 contractor equivalent positions. Most of our studies are department-wide. That is, we don't study just a function in a particular office, but we study the function across the complex. The Energy Department's complex is nationwide. We have 15,000 employees and about 100,000 contractors. Our IT study, for example, includes positions in 14 headquarters organizations and 19 separate field locations throughout the country. To date, we've completed 4 of those studies: civil rights reviews, financial services, logistics, and graphics. The government's bid, the in-house bid, the MEO, won 3 of these 4 studies. From the 4 completed studies, we expect to save nearly $43 million over 5 years. And we anticipate similar results from our ongoing studies and any studies we would conduct in the future.
At the Maritime Administration, we recently completed a commercial activity competition where the most efficient organization was the winner. In compliance with the FAIR Act, MARAD's 3 ship anchorage facilities were designated as commercial activities and were chosen for competition in 2001. One of the first decisions made was to package the 3 facilities as one activity. This encouraged a fair competition with commercial providers, since the government traditionally managed all 3 locations. The MEO team developed innovative processes for their proposal, designed a staff of their new organization, and calculated the cost. After a protest delay, the government MEO won the competition in September of 2003. Work originally performed with 195 positions was now to be done with 175.
As with every major project, it's important to regroup and think about what went well and what could be improved for next time. You are encouraged to add to the best practices and lessons learned posted on Share A-76 at the following website found by clicking on the Handouts tab. Regardless of the selected service provider, after implementing a performance decision, an agency will monitor performance for all performance periods stated in the solicitation. Implement the Quality Assurance Surveillance Plan. Retain the solicitation and any other documentation from the streamlined or standard competition as part of the competition file. Maintain the currency of the contract file. Record the actual cost of performance by performance period. And monitor, collect, and report performance information. Competitive sourcing is not an inflexible formula, but agencies have learned the type of elements that are critical to its success. Some of these elements include: be creative and take a long-term outlook. A one-size-fits-all approach is not practical when it comes to competitive sourcing. When looking at the long-term strategic goals of an agency, you should think of competitive sourcing as a tool to improve performance, create efficiencies, and generate savings in a way that fits with your culture and is fair to employees. OMB has asked agencies to develop green competition plans that tailor competitions around their mission and unique needs. Establish or connect with a high-level agency steering group. Studies show that involvement from senior officials encourages greater commitment and accountability from managers and employees to achieve results, allows for a high-level objective perspective, and ensures that the program is being executed consistently and fairly across the agency. At one agency, the Secretary writes editorials showing support and commitment for a fair competitive sourcing process. The Food and Drug Administration has a steering committee that includes directors from HR, IT, Equal Employment Opportunity, Real Property and Acquisition, and Facilities to discuss possible competitions and serve as the final decision-making authority on which activities to compete. And the Department of Energy's commitment comes from the highest levels of the department. Use internal management tools to assess progress. Management tools can help an agency stay on track and make rapid adjustments when weaknesses are identified. For example, the Defense Logistics Agency has standardized their data collection procedures and employed computerized management information systems to assist with data collection. Proactively engage in pre-planning. Evaluate the benefits and drawbacks of competition. Forecast the impact of a competition through a business case analysis or feasibility study when it is possible and practical to do so. Weigh potential performance improvements and expected cost savings against investment costs and risks. Look for activities that offer measurable efficiency gains. Build in time to determine if there is a market for the service up for competition. You may be able to generate interest by holding industry days, bidder conferences, or site tours, while also asking contractors for feedback on contract type and possible reasons they may not bid. Strategically grouping activities is another way to be successful. More agencies are moving away from small to large studies by grouping activities by function or geographic location. How close the function is tied to the mission of the agency and timing are factors that may impact an agency's ability to have a large study. You should also consider the impact on the private sector in terms of the type of contract they will be able to support. The scope of the contract, geographic location, employee disbursement, and timing are all points to consider when trying to attract a pool of interested bidders. Let's look at some examples. Before competing an activity, the Department of Energy, DOE, evaluates the extent to which a function can be competed as a business unit, as opposed to a collection of independent, unrelated positions. Feasibility assessments are reviewed by a high-level executive steering committee, chaired by the Deputy Secretary, which assures that the interests of all agency stakeholders are appropriately considered. In their first 3 competitions completed under the new circular, DOE reports a 25% or better annual savings for each function competed as compared to its baseline costs. DOE projects that the largest of the 3 competitions, which involved 159 FTE for financial services, will save taxpayers $30 million net over 5 years. The National Institutes of Health, NIH, developed a software program to aid its competitive sourcing decision makers. Among other things, the software considers the efficiency of and customer satisfaction with current operations, annual rate of staff turnover, long-term demand for function, and availability of function in the marketplace. The GAO cited NIH's software as a promising tool for identifying competitive sourcing candidates. NIH uses software to select grant support and real property functions as suitable candidates for competition. NIH expects to realize significant savings from these competitions. After careful planning, the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, subjected its testing services activity involving 180 FTEs to a standard competition and concluded that the reorganized, most efficient in-house organization can perform the work more cost-effectively than the private sector. OPM estimates savings of $10 million over a 5-year performance period, or $12,000 per FTE studied. Process improvements were also achieved through the implementation of an automated test scheduling system. The Department of Homeland Security expects better customer service at U.S. citizenship and immigration services to result from its competition involving well over 1,000 positions performing immigration information services. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, intends to consolidate multiple business activities currently performed by approximately 200 FTEs in a decentralized fashion to one shared services center. NASA anticipates the consolidation of services will allow redeployment of staff and budget to core mission needs. The Social Security Administration's Office of Systems continuously examines existing business processes to identify the best ways to implement efficiencies. In June 2003, SSA conducted a streamlined competition to evaluate the cost-effectiveness of its system software validation function. This unit provides services in the testing of automation software and test execution. The in-house provider was determined to be more cost-effective than private sector alternatives. Although SSA does not project specific monetary savings, it reports that the re-engineered in-house source operates at higher quality standards. While the savings generated from small streamlined competitions are likely to be more limited than what might be achieved from larger standard competitions, streamlined competitions can provide clear benefits when they are used strategically. OMB plans to review current guidance and consider changes to ensure streamlined competitions are used more effectively. In the meantime, at least 2 agencies with identified performance shortcomings are taking steps to address weaknesses and emulate successful practices. In particular, the Forest Service announced that it will rely more heavily on studies that reflect broader and related functional areas. In FY 2003, the Forest Service conducted more than 160 competitions, of which about half involved 3 or fewer FTEs. Forest Service officials acknowledged that there was generally little or no private sector interest in these fragmented competitions. In some cases, where work was not fragmented, private sector interest was low because the Forest Service grouped activities in ways that work would not normally be provided by the private sector. Incremental costs for these studies, which are expected to generate no savings, were well in excess of $6 million. To improve results, the Forest Service is now focusing its attention on larger, more strategically grouped studies. They include a service-wide 1,200 FTE standard competition for IT and 3 other standard competitions for fleet, road, and trail maintenance. The Department of Interior, DOI, has adopted a policy that will result in the development of MEOs routinely whenever the department pursues a streamlined competition involving more than 10 FTEs. DOI generally found little benefit from conducting streamlined competitions without forming MEOs. By contrast, DOI experienced significant savings, as described above, when it developed an MEO as part of the streamlined competition process. Align competitive sourcing and human capital activities. Competitive sourcing requires that competition decisions be aligned with the agency's human capital initiative. Both PMA initiatives share a common goal of seeking to improve mission performance by closing competency and skill gaps, identifying redundancies, unbalanced staffing, and other inefficiencies that cut across agency functions, restructuring organizations, redeploying resources to higher program priorities. To further mesh your competitive sourcing and human capital strategies, you should also consider whether a proposed competition addresses activities whose performance has been or could be affected by attrition, retirements, recruitment, or retention difficulties or skill imbalances. Time competitions to support workforce initiatives such as realignments, reorganizations, or consolidations, and minimize workforce disruption. Involve a human resource advisor, HRA, to assist the agency with several of its competition activities. Ideally, the agency's HR staff should be prepared to assist the agency's source selection authority by exploring opportunities for relocation, retraining, or the use of the voluntary early retirement and voluntary separation incentive payment.
We have the human capital organization involved with us, the organizational development change organization supporting us, the communications organization, the information technology, all of the senior leadership across the organization to help bring this to a successful conclusion.
And also think the senior executive leaderships and their communication with the employees has been a big factor also in getting this done. They've all taken a proactive role. They've gone out and met with the employees to deliver the news, whether good or bad. They have shown that they care and are working with the employees to bring about the change.
Of course, you know, communications is always important, and it can make or break a project. Employees want to feel like the communications are fair and open and honest, and that they're getting the same messages at the same time.
Something else that we've talked a lot about is the involvement of managers, because we know that employees ultimately are looking to their own managers for the answers to some of these difficult situations around competitive sourcing and ultimately a reduction in force. So we've tried real hard to give those managers the tools they need to help their employees.
In working towards our second goal, which was to minimize the negative impact of the process, we requested and received from the Office of Personnel Management voluntary early retirement authority and buyout authority. We provided group and individual retirement counseling to all interested employees. We fully implemented the provisions of the Career Transition Assistance Program, providing the employees the maximum amount of administrative leave allowable to search for other career opportunities.
At ACF, we've had 3 competitions, and quite frankly, we've lost all 3. What we've tried to do is make losing those competitions a lemons into lemonade story. Many time activities are transitioned to the private sector or public reimbursable sources, and we don't need to do those functions, so we save money.
DoD feels that we have many positive aspects of the program. Specifically, the program forces us to scrutinize our requirements as we develop a performance work statement, as well as competing our activities, and as well as implementing a good outcome that regardless of who the service provider is. It increases our performance and operations of our activities while reducing the cost to the taxpayer. That allows us to apply the savings to other higher priority programs. We feel that competition is the right way for government managers to manage their requirements as well as the taxpayer dollars.
After conducting all our studies, we learned some valuable lessons. Again, the most important is senior level management's commitment, leadership from the top commitment of your senior leaders. The second lesson, communicate, communicate, communicate with your employees. Third, you should have your studies run by federal personnel, career employees as your team leads, and hold them accountable for results. Fourth, you should involve the unions at all times at both the national and the local levels in designing the study and in coming up with solutions in the MEO. And finally, use support contractors to help you with the details of the A-76 studies.